Okay, the following is a series of interviews with Gerald Horne about his life. Although this is a biography, I just want to give a brief intro and a sneak peek into who Gerald Horne is. Dr. Horne currently holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor Horne is an activist, scholar, researcher, archivist, author, historian, and much, much more. Professor Horne, by my count, has written over 45 books and is considered one of the most prolific historians and authors of all time. He has written on a wide range of topics exploring issues of racism, white supremacy, liberation and labor movements, Black internationalism, and Professor Horne has even written books on Hollywood and the film industry, jazz and the music industry, and boxing. Professor Horne has won several awards, including one this week. Congratulations to Professor Horne for winning the American Book Award for his book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. You can find Professor Horne's books online. I recommend purchasing them on Esalen Books instead of Amazon. Esalen is spelled E-S-O space W-O-N. That's E-S-O space W-O-N. Professor Horne is interviewed almost daily on a broad range of topics, including current events. You can find Professor Horne's interviews, lectures, and latest writings on Facebook. In fact, I started a fan page entitled Gerald Horne, Greatest Living Mind. And there are at least 2 other fan pages where you can find his work. And also, you can find more interviews and lectures of Professor Horne on YouTube. Professor Horne also has a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. It is without a doubt my favorite radio show. You can listen live at kpfk.org and find older episodes there as well in the archive section. And to lead us into this discussion, I'd like to quote Cornel West. Quote, Gerald Horne is one of the great historians of our time. His scholarly erudition is impeccable. His revolutionary fervor is undeniable. I have one slight addition to that, and I would add that Gerald Horne is one of the great historians, minds, and activists of not just our time, but of all time. And Gerald Horne, I have one quick question before we start is, have you ever been introduced without the word prolific being used?
Well, yes. And actually, I should also mention one detail, which is today is Sunday, August 29th, 2021. And yeah, that's it.
Yes, that's an important detail.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, jumping into your life, when and where were you born?
Born in St. Louis, Missouri, 1949, in a segregated Jim Crow hospital, Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis, named after a Black lawyer, as I recall, who was an activist, and then, as I recall, died mysteriously, and then a hospital was named after him in the Black section of St. Louis. I'm also happy to say that in the Black section of St. Louis, one of the leading K through 8 primary schools was named after Toussaint Louverture, the hero of the Haitian Revolution. Those are my roots. My parents, both of my parents, came to St. Louis from Mississippi, the heart of darkness of the Deep South. My father was a truck driver, a member of what was once billed as the largest union in the capitalist world. Speaking of Teamsters, I'm not sure if it still holds that billing. And my mother, like so many Black women, intermittently engaged in what was called day work. That is to say, sort of housekeeping for affluent Euro-American families. And in fact, my father also once worked at a country club for affluent Euro-Americans in the St. Louis suburbs. And I'm laughing because sometimes he'd bring home all these leftovers from their banquets and feasts which of course we would be happy about, since the fare was oftentimes appetizing. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
And to just kind of jump in and out of what you stated, you were born on January 3rd, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
And to speak a bit more about the hospital you were born in, do you know more of the history?
Well, other than what I just articulated, I know that some decades ago, well after I left St. Louis, there was a major political struggle about closing this hospital. And in fact, as I recall, I recently saw a documentary on the website of the enterprise, whose name I guess I'll have to say Amazon Prime, about that struggle. And actually, it's a decent documentary. I knew some of the people who were on the front lines when that battle erupted. And if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of battles in various cities about the closing of Black hospitals. In some ways, it's an analog to the shutting down of Black enterprises as an emblem of so-called progressive integration. Although, and of course, you can speak of schools in that regard as well. In my jazz book, I talk about the padlocking of the so-called colored union, musicians local, which was not necessarily a step forward for these Black musicians. So that's all I really recall about Homer G. Phillips. Other than that, if I'm not mistaken, all my sisters and brothers were born at Homer G. Phillips.
If I may add, for the sake of an eventual audience, is that my understanding is the hospital was built in 1937.
Oh, good.
Closed in 1979.
Oh, good.
It was the first teaching hospital west of the Mississippi to serve Black patients.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And in 61, it had trained the largest number of Black doctors and nurses in the world, and it began offering training and work to foreign doctors who had been denied by other hospitals because of their race. And I think we'll get to this later when we talk about your college years, but I think you ended up interning for a politician in St. Louis that fought for the hospital to remain open.
Oh, sure. That's Congressman William Clay, whose son, who succeeded him, William Lacey Clay, was just defeated, that is to say, months ago, by Cori Bush, who is rocketed into the headlines, becoming a de facto member of the squad.
Right.
And recently led the protests on the steps of the Capitol against the shutting down of the moratorium on evictions, which of course the US Supreme Court has just validated, if I'm not mistaken, the end of the moratorium on evictions, though somehow I feel that all of that story has yet to be told. That is to say, there might be another chapter. And in the documentary I mentioned, there are some wonderful interviews with the Black doctors who trained at Homer G. Phillips, and nurses too, I might add. And of course, most of them are graduates of Howard University Med School in Washington, Meharry, and Nashville, the two major med schools for Blacks, because there's a long story that historians have dealt with about the shutting down of Black medical schools in the 20th century. So yes, that's where I first emerged on the scene.
And my understanding is your full name is Gerald Charles Horne. How
Yes.
did you get your name?
Well, it just occurred to me. I think like many Black people, I'm sort of alienated from my name because it's a British name and I don't see myself as British. So it just occurred to me that the Charles likely comes, I'm sure this is not from my parents, but in terms of its popularity, stems from Charlemagne, who in the 8th century, you might recall, in what is now France, repelled the invading Arabs, who of course had only recently taken over Spain where they ruled for 800 years until the Henge year of 1492. And you may recall well, I shouldn't laugh because it's really not funny. You remember the Charlie Hebdo episode?
Yes.
The religious zealots in France killed the editors of this magazine for alleged religious offenses. And so the right wing, and so there were these mass protests in opposition in France to these killings. And they were marching under the banner of Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie. And then the right wing in France says, you're damn right we're Charlie, Charlemagne. Repelled the Arabs in the 8th century. Now, with regard to Gerald, I learned a long time ago, I think by looking up in the dictionary, that Gerald is Old German for spear carrier, which I sort of relate to, because that means sort of a rank and file soldier. And, oh yeah, my father, I'm sort of named after my father, although his name, there hangs a tale as well, because my sister, one of my sisters who's into this genealogy, she was researching him and found that his surname originally was Holmes, Holmes, in Mississippi. But like so many Negroes in Mississippi, he got into hot water and had to flee one step ahead of the posse. And so he wound up in St. Louis. And then he changed the name from Holmes to Horne. And then, of course, his name is Jerry Charles Horne, Jerry. So I'm sort of named after him. Now, this is a case, as they say in the United States, of being high on your own supply. What I mean is that I remember I used to say, in order to, this was when I was a teenager, I have to confess, that my father's father was a slave in Mississippi. Now, I'm not really sure if that's true, but I used to say it all the time. I thought it added a certain authenticity. And so he might have been. I have to ask my sister because she's the genealogist. Yeah, that's the story of my name.
And how many siblings do you have?
Well, originally I had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and then 2 quote stepsisters. That is to say, offspring of my father, but not my mother, the 2. And one of my sisters passed away. We did books together, in fact. I think we did 2 books, because she was a professor at Berea College in Kentucky, which is quite a college. If I'm not mistaken, Carter G. Woodson, the premier Black historian of the first half of the 20th century, went to Berea College in Kentucky. It was like Oberlin, where my daughter is. It was a kind of abolitionist stronghold. If I'm not mistaken, we need to check Berea. I'm sure about Oberlin, though. And she passed away about 20 years ago. But my other siblings, except for the 2 stepsisters and my older sister, are still alive. And
the sister that you're referring to is Mary?
That's correct.
Yeah. Sorry for your loss. And what number sibling are you in the order?
Next to the youngest.
Okay. And your mother's name is Flora Horne.
Yeah, there hangs a tale too, because I've seen on certain documents that her name was Flodell, Flodell. But I have to ask my sister, but maybe at some point she thought that was too, well, when people come up from Mississippi, they're oftentimes derided for being country, so coming from a rural background. That's the origins of the National Urban League. That's why, which was organized about 1910, just as the Negro migration northward was beginning. And urban in the title is not an accident, because part of their mission was to sort of acclimate the rural folk into being urban, in terms of dress, speech patterns, et cetera. And so I suspect that Flowdale might have sounded too country.
Mm-hmm.
And so she got the name Flora. But, that's something my sister could answer.
And your parents are both from Mississippi?
Absolutely. My father, my maternal grandfather was actually a janitor at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. So he had college roots to an extent. And my father was from West Point, Columbia, Mississippi, or Columbus. It's either Columbus or Columbia, which, as I understand, is near the Alabama border.
And did your parents meet in St. Louis, or did they meet in Mississippi?
Yes, they met in St. Louis, but as I understand it, their families were acquainted with one another.
Okay.
But they encountered each other in Missouri.
And you would discuss your father kind of fleeing to St. Louis. Do you know more about that?
No, we haven't been able to track that down, although I'm sure my sister's on the case. I'm sure it was a typical episode. He probably, forgot to step off the sidewalk. Some Euro-American was approaching, and some trivia. The Etiquette of Jim Crow. There's a book by that title, by the way. Mm-hmm. And or it might have been something larger. Who knows?
Did they discuss when you were growing up why they left the state?
Well, I certainly imprinted on my consciousness are the tales of Mississippi. As my mother used to say, don't tell me nothing about Mississippi, because it was, it was terror. It was a reign of terror, basically. I mean, let's see, when Emmett Till, T-I-L-L, was slaughtered in Mississippi circa 1955, two of the stories, and I'm not making this up, two of the stories that are imprinted on my consciousness early on were stories about Emmett Till. I don't know if should I recount the story to the audience or people?
Sure.
Okay, this is the Black kid from Chicago, goes to Mississippi to visit relatives, is not altogether acquainted with the etiquette of Jim Crow, and either because of a speech impediment or something else, he is accused of whistling at a Euro-American woman. She tells her male relatives, they come in the middle of the night and drag him out of bed and slaughter him, basically. Interestingly enough, I found out subsequently, and I understand why it doesn't come up in the documentary. There are two documentaries about Emmett Till that you can easily find. And a book, I haven't read the book, although I know the author, Tim Tyson, Tyson. I don't know if he mentioned this, but apparently Emmett Till's father was a member of the US military who was killed or executed in France in 1944 because of allegations about sexual molestation, interestingly enough. Now, I understand why a documentary might not deal with that, because you have to maintain a narrative arc in a documentary. And in a book, of course, you can maintain a narrative arc and then have a footnote. Mm-hmm. I always found that intriguing. And the other story I recall from growing up, this is in 1953, when the Rosenbergs were executed, because the way my mother explained it to me was lamenting the fact, and this is what I remember, that these two little boys, now Robert and Michael Mirapole, because they were adopted, if you recall, by the lyricist and creator of the song Strange Fruit, which Billie Holiday made famous. My mother used to explain, isn't it a shame that these two little boys are left without parents? And that sort of stuck with me. And the other, one of the few episodes that I remember. Well, I remember a lot actually about growing up in St. Louis, but in terms of perhaps shaping my consciousness, is that this is probably before, maybe, believe it or not, maybe when I was 2 or 3 years old, I recall getting praise for being able to note the names of different models of cars, Chevrolet, Ford, etc. So, so that's what I recall.
And then, what you had talked about your maternal grandfather being a janitor at Mississippi State. Do you know what your other grandparents did?
I think he was worked in the fields, that he was, quote, sharecropper, unquote.
That would be your paternal grandfather?
My father's father.
Mm-hmm.
And then somehow, I'll have to check with my sister, but somehow I recall him actually being enslaved. My father was born in 1898.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've seen that on his birth certificate.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's interesting, or maybe I think it was his birth certificate, except as I recall on his birth certificate, his name was Jerry Charles Horne. So I don't know. We just found out that his name was actually Holmes, so I'll have to check that too. I mean, this is another story that I guess could be part of the narrative about how it's so difficult, even generations after slavery and Jim Crow, to track down your family roots. I mean, because it's so murky in certain instances.
How about your grandmothers? Do you know what they did for a living?
I think that they worked in the fields, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
That was the fate of a lot, as fate of a lot of the Negroes in Mississippi. I guess my grandfather was lucky. He probably worked in the fields part-time too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost sure he did.
And did you have a relationship with your grandparents?
Well, certainly with my maternal grandfather and grandmother. My father's parents, I don't recall them at all. They probably passed away either before I was born or shortly thereafter. But I certainly remember my maternal grandfather and grandmother because they moved to St. Louis, or if I'm not mistaken, they moved to Kinloch, Kinloch, which is one of these all-Black Jim Crow cities. When you think of these Jim Crow cities, oftentimes you think maybe of Mound Bayou in Mississippi or Boley, Oklahoma. Oklahoma had a number of all-Black cities. But Kinloch was one of these all-Black cities. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Congresswoman Maxine Waters comes out of Kinloch. It's right on the border of St. Louis.
And do you remember, your maternal grandparents, what they were like?
All I remember, I don't remember that much, except I don't really remember that much. And I probably mostly saw them on Sundays because I remember whenever I saw my grandfather, he had a suit on. And people usually didn't put on suits unless they were going to church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about all I recall.
And as a child, did you go to Mississippi to see where your...
Oh, no. I didn't. I've never been to... Wow. No, I've never been to where my parents born and raised. I've been to Biloxi.
Mm-hmm.
This was many decades later. I had to go to a political meeting. Biloxi, of course, is in the Gulf Coast. A footnote. So, I'm doing this book on Texas. One of the things I notice in going through my notes, sometimes you don't notice, after you accumulate all this material, then you try to put it together and you begin to, it takes a number of years. And so you can't always keep in your head what you've uncovered. So I've noticed that I have all these instances of suicide in the 19th century amongst settlers, amongst Africans, amongst indigenous. And one of the alleged mythical suicides takes place in Mississippi along the Gulf Coast. That's the thing about the United States. They exterminated so many of these Native Americans. So this may be a story rationalizing extermination, but supposedly the Pascagoula, and of course, Pascagoula is a city in Mississippi, which is notorious for a shipyard. So it must be on the Gulf Coast. How there was a mass suicide amongst the Pascagoula. Now, I'm not sure if that's true. It might have been an extermination. That's the thing about Texas, 19th century. They're always someone exterminating these. And I mean, that's the verb they use, not the verb I'm using. As a matter of fact, I start the book in 1859 when this US official wants to have these indigenous people put on reservations. But the settlers say, hell no, they need to be exterminated. And the US official objects, so they kill them and then proceed to exterminate this indigenous grouping.
And for the sake of their audience, you're referring to your next book.
Yeah, the book I'm working on in Texas.
And how come you didn't? You have this feeling where you don't want to go back to where your parents grew up, or?
Well, I guess I could go back, but I grew up with such negative memories. As I said, my mother, don't tell me nothing about Mississippi. No, it was, all the stories about having to get off the sidewalk when people were approaching. That's to show you the reverberations. I know when I was much younger in St. Louis, I was walking down the sidewalk and some Euro-American was approaching. I would never budge. I'd make them move over. And that was consciously intentional on my part because of the stories my parents told me. I mean, that's part of the legacy, that you're still, for those who may be concerned, I don't do that anymore. But it's part of the legacy of living under Jim Crow. Having these memories seared into your brain at an early age.
And did you have a relationship with your aunts and uncles?
Yeah, I did. Because there are lots of them. I mean,
did they also move to St. Louis from Mississippi?
St. Louis, East St. Louis, Milwaukee. Those are the cities I remember, although probably some were in Kansas City, Chicago as well. But it's up the Mississippi River, basically. And I remember my memories of them, recalling, I left St. Louis when I was 17. So that was a long time ago. But my memories of them, mostly they're in suits too, so it must have been on Sundays. Probably after church.
And where did your parents meet?
I'm not really sure. I have to ask my sisters. As I recall, their families were acquainted. So I'm sure. Plus, my father was 16 years older than my mother. Officially, might have been older. So, and his first wife had only died recently when he met my mother. I know that much.
And what was their formal education level?
Oh, well, my father, he didn't graduate from elementary school. My mother graduated from high school and would have gone to Alcorn, Alcorn, which is this historically Black college in Mississippi that's still with us, fortunately. And I think she wanted to go to Alcorn, but didn't have enough money. so she was not able. And I think that a lot of the education of her offspring, and that comes from her, basically, because I grew up listening to KMOX AM, so all news station in St. Louis. Used to be on in the background all the time. That was also the radio station of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. So on the radio in the background, I remember listening to the radio more than watching television, although I do recall watching television, of course. But I guess the radio has stuck more in my mind because it was nonfiction. I mean, it was news and baseball. And that's what my mother listened to. So that's what we listened to.
And you had talked about your parents' employment a bit. Your father was a truck driver and a teamster. And do you know what the Teamsters were like in St. Louis in the 50s and 60s?
I do. As a matter of fact, this is part of I think I mentioned that in that preface to Upending the Ivory Tower about Black students in the Ivy League. This is part of the mythos I've created, which is that the Teamsters in St. Louis were led by Social Democrats. As Henry Kissinger might say, this is a story that has the added advantage of being true. Which it was led by Social Democrat, Harold Gibbons, you can look it up. And whereas the Teamsters in much of the United States was led by gangsters, basically. And so Harold Gibbons and his comrades, they opposed the war in Vietnam, believe it or not, prematurely. Although, if I'm not mistaken, they still had problems dealing with the gangsters at the highest levels of the Teamsters. And in fact, part of the story of our family is how my father's Teamsters pension was eviscerated by these gangsters. It's a matter of public record. Matter of fact, I'm sure somebody has written about it because it generated a lot of court cases about investing in Las Vegas. It was a mobbed up union, except for Harold Gibbons in St. Louis, who also had Black Teamster leaders surrounding him. I used to know the names, I don't, although, a simple search would reveal their names.
Well, my understanding is that St. Louis, by the end of World War II, had the second largest rail and trucking hub in the country.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, the first neighborhood we lived in St. Louis, before it was torn down as a project of urban renewal, Negro removal, was not only near the stockyards, because there was always a pungent odor emanating from the stockyards. And as a matter of fact, I recall I had an Uncle Floyd, who worked in the stockyards. And of course, that was a progressive union too, the meat cutters. As a matter of fact, one of their Black leaders, Charlie Hayes, winds up in Congress, becomes a leader of the Congressional Black Caucus. That's out of Chicago, though. Charlie Hayes is out of Chicago. And I also recall that there were railroad tracks not far from where we lived as well. But, St. Louis suffered the fate of Detroit. Actually, Detroit more so than St. Louis, in the sense of post-1950 decline, which certainly in Detroit, for some reason I know more about Detroit than St. Louis. I guess because I've done research on and in Detroit. I mean, I haven't done the same amount of research on St. Louis, but part of, this is in my Civil Rights Congress book, which will be out in paperback shortly. It was originally published 1987. So, Detroit had a strong left-wing movement, had a strong Black movement. And as they said in Vietnam, they had to burn it down in order to save it, I guess, say the ruling class, in order to rid themselves of the left and the radical Blacks. They had to undermine the city.
Hmm.
Coleman Young, who was the first Black mayor of Detroit. I think I talk about this in the Civil Rights Congress book. And I know this also because I knew the late James Jackson, who was a Black leader of the US Communist Party. He and Coleman Young used to share a residence in Detroit because Coleman Young was part of that circle. Detroit Red, as they call it. Or maybe that's what they call Malcolm X. Anyway, he too had red hair. And and then George Crockett, who was the lawyer. I talk about that in my Ben Davis book, which came out paperback earlier this year. He was the lawyer for Ben Davis, the Black communist leader in the Smith Act trial of 1949. And in that case, not only were the defendants jailed, Crockett was jailed. The lawyer was jailed after the case ended. And then Crockett went on to become a judge and a member of Congress, Congressional Black Caucus leader. And when I was with the National Conference of Black Lawyers, I was able to raise $5,000 for our budget. And Crockett was the judge in the Republic of New Africa case of the 1960s, when there was a shootout post 1967, if I recall. And like Cut 'em Loose Bruce Wright, he let all the defendants go.
Mm.
So anyway, that's a digression about Detroit.
No, I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Back to your dad, do you know what kind of truck he drove and what he was hauling?
He mostly drove a cement mixer. I always look fondly on cement mixers when I see them in the streets nowadays. Mm-hmm. It makes me think of my father. He drove a cement mixer. In other words, this is a truck that's necessary, for construction, for building, cement, obviously.
And you had mentioned that your mom maybe was a domestic worker.
Yes. Although my sisters deny that, but I won't budge on this because I have this etched in my memory. I don't know why they deny it. Maybe they think it's embarrassing. I don't know. But I have etched in my memory of her coming home and talking about working in these people's houses. I don't think I made that up.
And my understanding is that there was a huge element of racism that played a role in the fact that she was limited to certain areas of jobs. Is that accurate?
Oh yeah, of course. This is St. Louis. Jim Crow, I lived through Jim Crow. I even said this in an interview on that interview I did on Jared Ball's network. Mm-hmm. Last dope intellectual with CBS.
Right.
Dr. Brown. That I lived through Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. I remember that I don't know if the Howard Johnson chain is still around, but it was this chain of restaurants. Mm-hmm. I remember I couldn't go into Howard Johnson's. Hell no. Mm-hmm. Unless I wanted to be embarrassed or worse. But St. Louis, it was a strange Jim Crow town because, if I'm not mistaken, the Negroes could vote, unlike in Mississippi, which obviously gives them a certain amount of leverage. As a matter of fact, the University of Houston was doing these stories about the American Book Award. Mm-hmm. So I was able to look at my high school yearbook, 1966. And in leafing through it, some things just struck me that I hadn't realized. There were so many clubs. It was all Black high school, Beaumont High School. There were so many clubs. Spanish football team, junior varsity football team, basketball team, B team, which is sort of junior varsity, Spanish club, school newspapers. There was all sorts of, a band with instruments. And it made me think, because I was thinking, well, how did this happen? Was it a product of political leverage? So that since people had the right to vote, they were able to say, okay, fine. It's just like those Supreme Court cases. Actually, this was in the New York Times just this morning, a book review, where the Supreme Court dealing with the separate but equal cases. there's a famous case in Missouri involving Lloyd Gaines, who is supposed to be admitted to the law school at the University of Missouri, and got admitted, and then he was disappeared. It's like in Pinochet's Chile. Hasn't been seen since. It's the late 1930s. And so the courts were saying, okay, you need to make it equal. So you have to start a law school for Negroes. As a matter of fact, they mention it. Actually, it's not funny. University of Arkansas. Well, I'm sure Negroes didn't have the right to vote there. So they let this Negro be admitted in the 1940s, but he had to take his classes in the basement of the law school to make sure that he was separate. There's a famous photo, I think it's either from Texas or Oklahoma, where the Negro law student, he's sitting in the classroom, but he's roped off. It's really something, the lengths to which the authorities went to segregate these Black people. But in any case, with regard to my high school, God, it was a lot of activity that I still find remarkable.
Yeah, I have a whole section of questions about your high school.
Good.
But referring back to your mother, sorry, I keep taking you back there.
Okay.
My understanding is that despite being one of the only 9% of African-American women in St. Louis to have attended a high school diploma, because of the racial discrimination, she was limited to just working in the personal service industry.
Mm-hmm. That's a fair assessment.
Yeah, so that, and that St. Louis in 1950 was so racially segregated that 37.6% of African Americans were unemployed.
Oh, God. I also remember this, that my father did a tour of duty in the, quote, workhouse, unquote, which I think is a sort of jail.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. Because I remember my mother, I was very young then. My mother frantically trying to raise money to get him out of the workhouse. I don't even recall what he did. My sisters probably know.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, were your parents politically active?
Well, they certainly, my mother, as I said, certainly followed them. My father was laconic. He didn't have that much to say. My mother, of course, had a lot to say. She listened to the all news radio all the time. I remember when I was 15 in 1964, LBJ is campaigning in St. Louis for, I guess you'd call it re-election. This is after the, election for president against Barry Goldwater. And I recall going to a rally for him in downtown St. Louis. I recall this because for the longest, the picture probably can be found, but on the cover of these civic textbooks in St. Louis and or Missouri, there was a picture of me at this LBJ rally. Because I think I was the only Black person. Yeah, I might have been the only Black person there. She's supposed to get all these Black votes, but I was the only Black person there. I was 15.
Right.
So yeah, but I'm sure that's a product. Actually, this will follow your chronology, I think. I'm sure that this was a product of reading the newspapers, which, as I've said many times, I began at an early age. St. Louis Post-Dispatch, St. Louis Globe Democrat. Pat Buchanan, the notorious Pat Buchanan, was an editorialist. His right-wing rag, the St. Louis Globe Democrat, which I used to sell. And since I was selling these newspapers at an early age, I began reading them. Oh, admittedly, without creating more of a mythos, admittedly, comic strips and the sports pages.
Mm-hmm.
I still read the sports pages first thing in the morning. I don't read the comics. Well, actually, I read the comic strips intermittently.
And But how old were you when you, that was your first job as a
Yeah,
child?
6 or 7 years old. Because at times I worked with my older brother,
Hmm.
who is 7 years older than I am. And, you know, of course, I'm against child labor, but uh, that job was very formative,
Hmm.
you know, coming into contact with journalism, newspapers. I remember being robbed. Actually, being robbed at an early age, I think, also alienated me towards money
Hmm.
because you know you could work, somebody can come take it,
Hmm.
and so I'm sure in my young mind that probably alienated me towards, well, to contribute to a mythos. It alienated me towards capitalism.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Well, that's terrifying.
I hear you. I hear you.
Speaking of your parents' kind of politics, you had mentioned in an excellent interview in 2016 on C-SPAN's In-Depth program
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
that your mother was one of your biggest inspirations.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
How
because you know she
how so?
followed the news. She read the newspapers. She was a big sports fan. Knew a lot about baseball. Oftentimes, I've thought about writing a play. A, you know, when you do these dramas, you always have to tell a story that has larger implications. And so the play would be about growing up in St. Louis with my mother despising the St. Louis baseball teams because it was such Jim Crow teams. I mean, worse than the norm. And she rooted for the Brooklyn Dodgers because of Jackie Robinson.
Mhm.
And of course, the Dodgers and the Cardinals were big rivals. Whereas, I don't know, I rooted for the Cardinals. And so it would sort of be like Raisin in the Sun, where you have this dramatic conflict over generations that hopefully would tell a larger story. Because it is part of a larger story, actually.
You've never written a play before, have you?
No, although I noticed that in my yearbook, I acted.
Huh.
There's a picture of me acting in my yearbook in a skit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the skit was about?
Yeah, this. I'm embarrassed to say that the skit was my sort of spoofing the would-be cool Negroes in high school. You know, because of course they dressed a certain way, they talked a certain way, they had a certain affect, and so I spoofed them on stage. I'm surprised I didn't get my butt kicked afterwards.
Was it was it like a freestyle or was there a script beforehand or?
Well, I think it was an improv. It was
Uh-huh.
improvisation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's the word I should have used was improv. But
Right,
I always forget the stage language.
right.
And then you had alluded to this earlier, but the first neighborhood you grew up in was referred to as Mound City.
Oh, no. Mill Creek Valley, Mound City, interestingly enough.
Oh, Mound City is the name of St. Louis.
Exactly. And the whole region, the whole metropolitan region. Because,
Okay.
as a matter of fact, last time I was in St. Louis, which was a few years ago, I visited for the first time this historic site, Cahokia, who a millennium ago maintained the largest urban node in North America before they were exterminated. And it's a historic site now. I took my daughter to it, and one of my sisters went. And in my neighborhood, my second neighborhood in St. Louis, there was Mound City Bank. So Mound City is a descriptor for St. Louis, which comes out of the Cahokia background.
And my understanding is named after ceremonial mounds.
Yes. Yeah, they're large too. They're very large.
And so you grew up in Mill Creek Valley.
That's right.
What was Mill Creek Valley like?
Well, it was all black area. Like, let me resort to cliche. I mean, it's fine to me. I mean, but I didn't know anything else. That's all I knew. But when I was about 11 years old, the authorities said, you Negroes got to get out of here. We're building a highway. And also St. Louis University decided to reclaim some of this land too, which is a stone's throw from where I grew up. That is to say, St. Louis University. Also, downtown St. Louis is not that far. It was a typical city in that the Negroes were near the center of town. And of course, what's happening now in terms of urban studies is that the Negro, at one time, the Euro-Americans, they wanted to live in the suburbs. Negroes were in the, what do they call it? The inner city, to use that euphemism. But now, and actually it began in St. Louis half century ago, or actually about 6 decades ago, where you move the Negroes out of the center city and it's reclaimed. That's happening in Washington now, in fact. As a matter of fact, there was this unfortunately titled headline in the Washington Post just a week or so ago after the results of the 2020 census were revealed. And the headline was, "Goodbye Chocolate City," because that was the name once she used for Washington. But Negroes are being pushed out. And that's what happened to us in St. Louis, pushed out of Mill Creek Valley.
And that was in 1959.
1959, 60. As a matter of fact, there's an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about, that's another newspaper I sold. It's still with us. Although, of course, it's fallen on hard times like most of these newspapers. There's an article, I think it features my younger brother, Marvin, although I doubt if it would come up in their database, but it might, who knows. But they were interviewing him about being ousted from Mill Creek Valley and having to move to my next neighborhood.
And the conditions, my understanding is not necessarily your home, but the conditions in Mill Creek Valley of the homes was poor.
Yeah, that's what I found that out later.
Right.
When we were forced out, I guess I was 11 or 12. So, what did I know?
Right.
But that's what I've been made to understand.
Yeah, I mean, my research showed that 80% of homes lacked a private bathroom.
Is that right?
Toilets, yeah. 67% were without running water.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, we had a wood burning stove, which we relied upon oftentimes in winter for heat. Because I recall trying to get close to it. So I feel warm. And then we'd have these portable heaters that ran by electricity, which of course is very dangerous. The source of many fires. So I do recall that much. I recall we didn't have a bathtub, because I remember we had one of these big metal tubs where you had to bathe. Although we did have an indoor toilet, I do recall that much. I think I'm almost sure of that.
And before we jump a little bit more into what happened in '59, do you recall, where you went to elementary school?
Yeah, I went to Johnson Elementary School. I didn't go to Toussaint Louverture, unfortunately. That would have been fantastic. Something I could brag about. But I went to Johnson School.
And I'm assuming that was a public school?
Of course.
And Brown v. Board of Education came out in 54. How did that impact your elementary schooling?
Well, Johnson School, not that much. Now, Ashland, the second school I went to after we were forced to move, it was a typical, when we first moved, of course, it was a predominantly Euro-American neighborhood, heavily Euro-American school, Ashland School. But it doesn't take long for the white folks to flee, and soon it was an all-black school, Ashland, and an all-black neighborhood. And I drove through there a few years ago, and my daughter, who grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, was, as they say, gobsmacked by the neighborhood that I grew up with. And I have to say, I was a bit too, even though I grew up there. It's one of hard times.
And my understanding is in 1957, you got your first library card?
Oh, that's right. 5715980, if I'm not mistaken, was the.
That's right. That's what I have.
Yeah.
57-15980.
Yeah, because we used to go to the big public library, like 42nd Street in New York. It was within walking distance of our home in Mill Creek Valley. So myself and my sisters, we used to walk there all the time. And I remember reading, who knows if the St. Louis Public Library still has the records, but I recall reading many biographies, these typical sort of, about so-called Revolutionary War heroes, Civil War heroes, and all the rest. And I recall also then later in high school, reading a lot of novels. Unfortunately, I'm trying to reclaim the habit of reading novels. Since I'm in hibernation, I may have to start writing fiction. So I decided I need to read more fiction. But in high school, I used to read novels a lot. All sorts of novels.
So, and I guess in 58, in 57, you were 8 years old.
That's right.
So by that age, were you already very interested in reading?
Oh, yeah. Oh, of course. Reading newspapers and then migrating to biographies.
And how were you as a student in elementary school?
I was probably a good student. I mean, there are probably still, one of my sisters lives in my second neighborhood house, and I'm reasonably sure in the basement that there are my report cards. She says that they're not there, and I'm sure there must be there. But that's of course the influence of my sisters, I think, because as you know, this sort of gender construction, whereby at least in these Black neighborhoods, it was socially acceptable for girls to read, and of course, because of male chauvinist practices, it was oftentimes problematic for girls to leave the home. And so they could be at home reading. And then as part of this inchoate rebellion that oftentimes characterized Black male life, oftentimes it was not cool to act similar. But I was influenced by my sisters, so always, we used to go to the library together. And they're older than I am. So they had seniority and leverage. So that was an influence in terms of pushing me in a certain direction.